All right, let's talk about the pack that never sleeps. The Space Wolves. Something big just dropped, and everyone's howling about it. The new models for the Sons of Russ have hit the tabletop like a thunderous charge across a snow-covered battlefield, and whether you're a fan of the Fang or not, it's impossible to ignore the seismic waves they're sending through the community. Forums are lighting up, painters are scrambling to perfect that icy Fenrisian fur, and tacticians, they're re-evaluating entire tournament lists because of these newcomers. There's something different about this wave. It's not just a cosmetic refresh or a niche unit update. No, this feels like a bold statement from Games Workshop. Space Wolves are back, and they're coming for the top tables. But of course, that begs the question that everyone's whispering between dice rolls. Are they really that good? Or is this just another case of model hype inflating expectations before reality brings it all back down to earth? Because we've seen this before, right? A beautiful model drops, collectors and lore fans rejoice, but then it lands on the battlefield with all the impact of a wet bolter round. And yet, this time, the excitement feels more grounded. Competitive players, the ones who crunch the math, know the matchups, and live and breathe tournament results, are taking notice. That alone should make any Warhammer player perk up their ears. So, what is it exactly about these new Space Wolves models that has the meta-watchers so stirred? Are we witnessing the rise of a new top-tier army, forged not just in lore but in lethality? Or are these just fresh fangs on an old wolf, more bark than bite? Let's dig into it. From aesthetics and unit mechanics to matchups, meta shifts, and beyond. Because if the battlefield is changing, we need to know how. And the answer might just lie within the icy heart of Fenris. There's something about the first time you lay eyes on a new model that sticks with you. It's that gut reaction, the kind that makes you stop scrolling, open your wallet, or message your group chat with nothing but a photo and a string of exclamation marks. That's exactly what happened with the new Space Wolves releases. The moment those images hit the Warhammer community site, the fan base exploded. Not in frustration or confusion, like we sometimes see with polarizing sculpts, but in unified awe. These new models didn't just drop. They landed fully armed and snarling, and they brought a heavy dose of Fenrisian fury with them. The visual design this time around feels like a love letter to everything that makes the Space Wolves iconic, but with a crispness and clarity we haven't seen before. The details are so sharp they practically cut through the sprue. There's a primal energy in their poses. No generic, we're marching into battle stiffness here. These wolves are lunging, snarling, striking mid-swing, mid-howl, like they were frozen in the middle of an epic saga. You can almost hear the clash of frost axes and the howl of Fenrisian winds just looking at them. And the armor, it's not just ornate for the sake of being flashy. It tells a story. Each rune-etched plate, each pelt, every clawed embellishment feels earned, like it was taken from the corpse of a slain beast or gifted by the priests of the Iron Priests after a ritual hunt. They've managed to balance the brutal and the mythical, grounding them in the ferocity of war while still elevating them with the majesty of saga and legend. Fans have been calling it the most Space Wolves-looking Space Wolves we've seen. And honestly, that's spot on. A lot of players I know, even those who aren't usually drawn to the Imperium, have been pulled in by the aesthetic power of these minis. One buddy of mine, a die-hard TOE player, literally said, "I don't care about wolves, but I might build a kill team just to paint these." That kind of reaction isn't just about surface-level coolness. It speaks to the depth and intentionality behind the design. There's narrative in every crease of the cloak, every fang-shaped shoulder guard. These aren't just models, they're storytelling tools. It's wild how much visual design impacts perceived power. It's almost irrational, but it's very real. A model that looks like it could tear through enemy lines tends to feel more threatening, even before it's rolled a single die. That psychological effect bleeds into gameplay more than people admit. When your opponent sees a squad of snarl-faced warriors decked in furs, leaping off jagged terrain with lightning claws at the ready, it sets a tone. Even if they don't know the rules yet, they're already mentally preparing for a brutal fight. It adds pressure, it affects decisions, it gives presence, and presence can win you games, not just hearts. There's also been a lot of buzz in the painting community, which is a whole meta in itself. Artists are thrilled about the textures. From the fur to the armor layering, there's so much surface detail to work with. Painters who usually shy away from Space Marines are giving these a shot because they offer more variety than the usual blue armor, gold trim formula. You've got that muted, icy palette mixed with warm leathers and rugged trophies, and the way that contrast plays out makes for a visually gripping force on the tabletop. Some fans have pointed out that these models feel more like characters than just troops. Even the rank and file look like they could headline their own Black Library novel. That's not a small feat. In an era where some kits feel a bit too safe or generic, these wolves stand out with personality. You look at them and immediately start building a backstory in your head. This one took down a chaos spawn alone with his bare hands. That one wears the pelt of the last Fenrisian white bear. You don't get that kind of narrative impulse from just any sculpt. There's also been some hilarious debate over the sheer masculinity of these models. People are joking that they look like they'd chop down a tree just to yell at it. But that intensity, that over-the-top wildness, is exactly what the Space Wolves should be. They're not polished. They're not stoic. They're howling berserkers with a code of honor etched in blood and ice. These new designs embrace that unapologetically, and fans, both casual and hardcore, are eating it up, and I'll be honest. When I first saw them, I didn't even care what their stats were. I just knew I wanted them. That's rare for me. Usually I analyze, compare, theory craft. But these hit different. They hit the part of me that got into this hobby not for win rates or tournaments, but for stories and aesthetics, and that visceral, hell yeah reaction when you see something that just gets it right. What's fascinating is how this aesthetic impact trickles into perceptions of game balance. Even before rules dropped, people were already assuming these guys would be top tier just because they look like they should be. There's power in that, not in terms of mechanics, but in perception, and in this game, perception is half the battle. Opponents second-guess themselves, players gain confidence. A beautiful model isn't just art, it's momentum. So while we'll dig into the crunchy details soon, stats, roles, synergy, we can't overlook the importance of that first impression. The new Space Wolves models didn't just show up to the battlefield, they announced themselves. And whether or not they end up dominating the meta, they've already dominated the conversation. That in itself is a kind of power. When I first dove into the datasheets for the new Space Wolves units, it honestly felt like unearthing some long-lost saga, like the kind that gets passed down around a fire on a frozen Fenrisian night. Each unit felt distinct, flavorful, and packed with character, almost as if Games Workshop was saying, "Remember what made these guys special? Let's double down on that." And wow, did they ever. Let's start with the one that instantly stole the spotlight, the new Wolfen unit. Now, I know Wolfen have always had a bit of a cult following, pun fully intended, but this time they've been reimagined with more than just raw savagery in mind. The sculpts alone scream controlled chaos. Their profiles blend feral beast with disciplined killer, and it shows in their rules too. These guys are still tearing through armor like it's parchment, but there's a new edge to them, something more focused. One friend described them as just angry enough to be terrifying, but not so out of control they trip over themselves. And that feels about right. Their abilities reflect that. They're fast, brutal, and relentless, but there's a tactical underpinning that's hard to miss. They're not just frothing berserkers anymore. They're apex predators. Then we've got the updated version of the Frostclaw pack. This one surprised a lot of us because it wasn't just a rehash of existing assault intercessors with some wolf icons slapped on. No, these guys are their own beast entirely. Close combat specialists with a flair for fast engagement, they feel like the spiritual successors to the old-school Bloodclaws, but with a bit more control and grit. Their movement flexibility and ability to chain into fights make them feel aggressive in a really satisfying way. And the community response? Overwhelmingly positive. Some are already calling them the teeth of the pack, which feels weirdly poetic coming from people who usually talk in damage output and CP efficiency. Now let's talk about the new character, Rolf Thunderhowl. And oh man, this guy. The moment I saw him, I knew he'd be one of those centerpiece models that becomes the face of a generation of players. He's got that classic lone wolf energy, but wrapped in this larger-than-life aura that makes you want to build an entire list just to watch him carve a bloody path through enemy lines. The design is pure drama. The windblown cloak, the oversized axe, the snarling expression. And mechanically, he's built to lead from the front. There's this vibe of tragic nobility to him that I can't stop thinking about. Like, he's not just here to win, he's here to die well. A lot of fans are already comparing him to Ragnar Blackmane in terms of thematic weight, but with more of a last stand tone. It's epic, and it gets under your skin in the best way. We also got a new Primaris-style wolf priest, and I'm so glad they finally gave this iconic role the love it deserves in plastic form. He's got this stoic, ritualistic look, not flashy but filled with presence. The Croceus is brutal and ceremonial, like something you'd see raised over the body of a fallen brother before the battle turns into a frenzy. His utility seems rooted in bolstering the charge, a spiritual anchor right before the teeth sink in. Some fans say he's less showy than they expected, but I think that's the point. He's the calm before the storm, the one who reminds the pack of their purpose before they unleash hell. Another standout is the new Fenrisian Hounds pack, reworked both visually and functionally. These aren't just aesthetic side pieces anymore. They've been reimagined to feel like part of the hunt. Their rules now reflect real battlefield roles, harassers, flankers, and disruption units. They're leaner, meaner, and finally worth fielding, not just because they look cool, but because they do cool stuff. One fan on Reddit put it best. They finally feel like they have a reason to be snarling at my opponent's deployment zone instead of just being furry missiles I never want to waste points on. Oh, and there's the new Rune Seer model. Not just a reprint or a renamed librarian, but someone who actually brings a unique Fenrisian flavor to psychic warfare. The miniature looks like he's about to call down an avalanche of ice and spirits. Wild hair, ancient runes glowing, power barely contained behind stormy eyes. He doesn't just wield the warp, he commands it like it's part of his bloodline. Mechanically, he's bringing more utility to the psychic phase, which is something Space Wolves haven't always been famous for. But here, it works. It feels natural, earned. The lore heads are loving it. Finally a psyker who feels like he belongs in the sagas, not just a marine with a different helmet. One thing that's been really exciting is how each new unit, while cohesive in theme, feels distinct in role. There's not a lot of overlap or, well, this one's just a better version of that. Everything has its place, its rhythm in the pack. Some fans are already speculating on the potential for narrative campaigns centered around these units, like forming a hunting party with the Rune Seer, Wulfen, and Fenrisian Hounds. A sort of mobile war covenant that feels ripped straight from a saga. It's not just competitive buzz, it's creative inspiration, and that's always a sign that a release has landed well. Of course, alongside these named units, there's been chatter about a few datasheet tweaks to older units, like the Thunderwolf Cavalry, getting subtle synergistic nudges to make them more relevant when paired with the new arrivals. That's not the focus right now, but it's worth noting that this wave isn't isolated. It feels curated, like a coordinated effort to breathe new life into the entire faction. In the end, what struck me most about these new additions wasn't just their rules or their looks. It was how cohesive they felt. Every new unit adds to the mythology of the Space Wolves. It's not just an update, it's a reinforcement of identity. These aren't just bolter marines with wolf heads, they're legends in the making. And for the first time in a while, it feels like the studio gets that. If we're going to talk about the impact of the new Space Wolves models, we first have to take a step back and look at where the Sons of Rust stood before this wave crashed down. Because honestly, it's been a strange few years for the Volkafenrika. Space Wolves have always had a certain mythic weight in the lore, these fierce, independent warriors with their own traditions, rules, and a wild streak a mile wide. But their presence in the competitive meta? That's been complicated. Before the latest refresh, Space Wolves sat in this awkward space. Not unplayable by any means. They had teeth, no question. But they always felt like they were just a step behind the curve. A little too reliant on getting the first swing. A little too brittle if they didn't. That's not to say they weren't fun or thematic, quite the opposite. Plenty of us die-hard wolf lords kept showing up with our frost claws and thunderhammers, trying to prove a point on sheer stubbornness alone. But when you looked at the data, when you looked at the win rates, it was hard not to feel like the pack was howling in the shadows while other chapters soaked up the spotlight. The playstyle was always aggressive, built around melee dominance and getting up close fast. But the problem was, the game had changed. Shooting became more efficient, durability became more layered, and mobility became more dynamic. And Space Wolves didn't always keep up. Sure, they had some strong units. Thunderwolf cavalry still hit like a freight train when they made contact. Blade Guard veterans with Wolf Guard buffs could carve through just about anything, but none of it felt particularly unique anymore. You could build something similar, or better, with White Scars, Blood Angels, even Black Templars, depending on the meta. The flavor was there, but the edge? Not always. One of the recurring frustrations was inconsistency. You either overwhelmed your opponent early with charges and board pressure, or you stalled out and got shot off the table. There wasn't a lot of room for recovery. Their stratagems were decent but situational. Their characters were flavorful but sometimes overpriced. And their psychic game? Honestly, kind of weak, which always felt ironic for a chapter so tied to ancient rites and spirit-guided visions. The lore painted them as wise yet savage, but in-game, they often felt like slightly clumsier brawlers who couldn't afford to stumble. A lot of players leaned into thematic builds just to keep things interesting. Tons of Wolfen, deep strike-heavy lists with Wolf Guard, or Thunderwolf bombs that relied on turn 1 charges and luck. They weren't bad lists, but they were high risk, high reward, and not in a good way. The kind of army where if you won, it felt epic, but if you lost, it was over by turn 2 and left you wondering what you could have done differently. That kind of gameplay wears you down after a while. It turns your love for the faction into something a bit more bitter. You start hoping for buffs, dreading nerfs, and watching every new codex drop from the sidelines like a forgotten cousin at a feast. It didn't help that a lot of their units felt like leftovers from older design eras. There was this lingering sense that GW hadn't quite figured out how to translate the soul of the wolves into the new Primaris-dominated world. They had Primaris units, of course, but not all of them fit. Intercessors and Eradicators were strong staples. But did they feel like Space Wolves? Not always. The synergy wasn't quite there. You ended up with a patchwork force. Some Primaris, some old-school kits, some Wolfen who felt like they were living in a different edition, and it was hard to build a cohesive strategy that felt both effective and narratively satisfying. Community reactions were mixed. Some players left the faction for more competitive armies, jumped ship to Custodes or Chaos Knights, seeking something with clearer power. Others stuck around out of pure loyalty, stubbornness, or just because they loved painting wolves on shoulder pads. I was one of those, constantly tweaking lists, hoping the next FAQ or chapter approved would give us a little more bite. Every small win felt like a hard-earned saga, but the losses? They piled up. And let's be honest, it sucks when your army feels like it's trying to catch up just to feel relevant. There were moments of glory, though. That one guy at your local tournament who brought a wolf-heavy list and went 3-1. The Reddit posts breaking down underdog wins. Those gave us hope. They reminded us that Space Wolves could still work, but it often felt like you were working twice as hard for the same results. And in a game as demanding as 40K, That's a recipe for burnout. I think what stung the most was that the soul of the army never left. The themes, the lore, the character, it was all there, burning bright. But the rules didn't always back it up. You'd read about saga-born heroes slaying demons with one arm tied behind their back, and then watch your own hero get melted off the board by plasma turn 1. That disconnect hurt. It made you crave a version of the army where the feel and the function finally lined up. So when whispers started about a new wave of models, the hype wasn't just about getting cool new toys. It was about hope. Hope that Space Wolves might finally get the tools to fight on equal footing again. Hope that the aggression could be more than just a gamble. Hope that playing the Sons of Fenris could be more than a thematic choice. It could be a viable one. Because if there's one thing every Space Wolves player knows, it's this. We don't need to be the best. We just need to be feared again. We need our enemies to see the long fangs, the frost axes, the snarling packs racing across the snow, and respect them. And for a long time, that wasn't the case. But now, with the new models on the table, something has changed. You can feel it in the way people talk, the way opponents eye your army with a little more caution. The howl is rising again, and maybe, just maybe, it's time to show the galaxy that the wolves never truly left. The moment I put the new units on the table, something just clicked. It wasn't dramatic at first, no cinematic charge or table-flipping victory. But by the end of turn 3, I realized I had played a completely different kind of Space Wolves game than I had in years. And that's when it hit me. This release isn't just a visual upgrade or a fan service drop. It changes the rhythm of the army, the pacing, the flow, the feel. It's like they finally remembered that wolves don't just bite hard, they hunt smart. Let's start with the tempo, because that's the first thing that stood out. Before, playing Space Wolves often meant going all in by turn 1 or 2. You'd line up your charges, hope your advance rolls didn't betray you, dump every buff you had into a single strike, and pray it stuck. But if it didn't, you were left holding a very expensive, very dead pile of bodies while your opponent started their cleanup. There wasn't much room for finesse. It was brutal, binary, and exhausting. But with the new models, the game feels smoother. It's still aggressive, don't get me wrong, but it's layered now. You're not betting the whole game on a single wave of fury. You've got pieces that can harass, bait, reposition, or hit at different angles and turns. The Frostclaw pack, for instance, gives you this mobile melee pressure that you can throw out early without committing everything. They move with intent. You don't have to sacrifice them to make a point. They're flexible enough to play around objectives, screen, and still threaten a charge if your opponent slips. And then there's Hrolf Thunderhowl. I can't tell you how refreshing it is to have a centerpiece melee character who doesn't just buff passively or die in a blaze of disappointment. He moves the battlefield around him. His aura is both literal and psychological. You drop him on a flank, and suddenly your opponent is shifting everything to deal with him. That alone creates opportunities elsewhere. It's control, but the wolf kind of control. Not with tricks and re-rolls, but with raw presence and the looming promise of violence. The reworked Wolfen are a massive part of this shift too. Previously, Wolfen were a bit of a liability, too fast, too bloodthirsty, and often running out ahead of support. Now, they feel like a proper instrument, still wild, still terrifying, but usable in actual combinations. You can hold them back for a turn, time their entry, and force your opponent into awkward decisions. If they commit to a different threat, Wolfen punish them. If they focus the Wolfen too early, something else slips through. They finally feel like they belong in a cohesive army, not like some untrained pets you unleash and hope for the best. Even the new Rune Seer adds a layer of strategy we didn't really have access to before. Wolves have always been light on psychic nuance, often relying on brute force or passive buffs. But now, there's a real choice. Do you use him to debuff key targets? Do you shield your advance? Do you hunt enemy psychers with precision? It's subtle, but it opens doors. More importantly, it makes Space Wolves feel like they have options. And that, more than anything, is what makes a faction feel alive. And let's talk about those Fenrisian hounds. It's easy to overlook them, but their ability to tag units, control space, and frustrate enemy plans is a game changer. I've had games where they didn't kill a thing, but they won the game by being in the right place, tying up a tank, or forcing a bad Overwatch decision. That's not something we've had before. We used to rely on overwhelming force. Now we can play the board. It feels good. It feels earned. What's wild is how much this affects your mindset. You go into matches not thinking, how do I survive until I hit combat, but instead, how do I shape the flow of the game turn by turn? You're still bringing the fury, still embracing the charge, but it's no longer a one-note strategy. You've got pressure at multiple ranges, threats that scale with time, and characters that shape the battlefield rather than just decorate it. It makes you feel like a commander again, not just a battering ram on legs. I've heard some people say this update brings the Wolves closer to a Blood Angels light style. Fast, punchy, explosive. But honestly, I think that undersells what's happening here. Blood Angels play like angels, elegant, calculated, poetic in their violence. Wolves snarl, they surround, they close in. This isn't about leaping from the sky, it's about the hunt, and these new models let us play the hunt, not just the kill. Even list building feels different. You're not stuck wondering how to fit a brittle melee bomb into a game full of indirect fire and castle metas. You can spread your threats, support them properly, and pivot mid-game if needed. That's huge. I've seen Wolves players starting to talk about reactive plays, using units as bait, playing off objectives, even leveraging deep strike not for alpha strikes, but for timing. When's the last time we could say that about Space Wolves? The biggest change, though, might just be confidence. There's something about bringing a force that doesn't feel outdated, outmatched, or overly gimmicky. The new Wolves play like they belong in 10th edition. They don't feel like they're trying to keep up. They feel like they're setting the tone. And even when the dice go south or the matchups aren't ideal, there's this underlying sense of agency now. You can do things. You can adapt. That's worth more than any single rule or stat line. This isn't just about being more competitive, though that's certainly part of it. It's about identity. The way these units interact, the way they move, the way they hit, it all reinforces that primal, saga-driven spirit we love. It's not just, here come the melee Marines. It's, here comes the pack, and that distinction matters. It matters in how you build lists, how you narrate games, and how you feel while playing. So yeah, the new models change the game, not just by making us stronger, but by making us smarter. They give us tools to play on our terms. They let us be the wolves we always knew we were. And after years of feeling like a howling echo in a meta that didn't listen, that finally feels like a victory. One of the biggest questions we started asking once the new Space Wolves units hit the table was simple. How do they hold up against the big dogs of the current meta? Because sure, it's exciting to get new toys, but in the end, we all want to know if they actually make a difference in real matchups, not just in theory, but where it counts. And I'll be honest, going into those first few games with the updated roster felt like entering the arena all over again. Same battlefield, same opponents, but suddenly, the Wolves were fighting with a new kind of bite. Take Adeptus Custodes, for example. These guys have been a nightmare for melee-focused armies for what feels like forever. Toughness, invuls, and brutal counterpunching. Before the new release, playing against them often felt like slamming your head against a golden wall. You'd throw in your best, and they'd tank it, kill a few wolves in return, and just hold ground. But now there's nuance. With the flexibility of the Frostclaw pack and the new Rune Seer's debuffs, you can set up charges more intelligently, target weaknesses more precisely. You're not just throwing meat into the grinder and hoping something sticks. You're cutting around the armor, pushing at their positioning, making them answer to your threats instead of just sitting there absorbing everything. It's still tough, no one's denying that, but there's a sense of possibility now that just didn't exist before. On the flip side, Tau used to be one of those matchups where wolves either broke them fast or got gunned down trying. And while the danger's still there, those railguns and Overwatch mechanics aren't going anywhere, the dynamic has shifted. The reworked Fenrisian hounds have added a kind of stealth disruption that Tau players aren't used to dealing with. You can bait Overwatch, force bad lines of sight, and tie up fragile units without sacrificing half your army. The wolves finally have tools that let them control Tau instead of just chasing them down in desperation. I've already seen some Tau players start adapting their lists to anticipate this, adding more screening units, rethinking deployment. That's a win in itself. If your opponent has to change their game plan because of your faction, you've already influenced the match. Then there's Chaos Space Marines, always a spicy matchup, especially the newer cult-heavy lists or the Iron Warrior-style shooting bricks. These were games that used to swing wildly. If you got the charge off, you had a chance. If you didn't, you just evaporated. But now, with a more layered army and the ability to threaten on multiple turns instead of just turn one, the matchup feels more stable. You can pick apart cult units with smart movement, and Hrolf is an absolute nightmare for characters trying to stay protected. One of the local players I faced actually said, "He's like a missile made out of hate." And yeah, that's accurate. But more importantly, the wolves finally have some staying power. You don't just fizzle out when your wolfen don't connect. There's more to lean on now. Eldar are still a puzzle. Let's not sugarcoat it. Their speed and trickery can make even the best melee army feel slow. But here's where it gets interesting. Wolves used to struggle massively with the hit-and-run style of Eldar. They'd bait charges, phase away, or just zip out of range. But with the new Wolves builds, you've got layers of threat. You can box them in better. The Frostclaws can plug gaps, the Rune Seer can punish key units, and the Hounds can corral movement. It's not a guaranteed win, far from it, but it doesn't feel hopeless anymore. There's a growing theory in the community that Wolves might become one of the few melee armies that can actually track Eldar effectively, simply because they can now threaten multiple areas of the board instead of focusing everything into one desperate charge. Against Tyranids, it's a bit of a different story. Big bugs have always been a challenge, especially when they stack buffs and resilience. In the past, Wolves had a decent shot thanks to their raw damage output, especially with Thunderwolf cavalry and power fists. Now, they can approach it more tactically. You can soften up the monsters before engaging. You can tie down synapse nodes or objective holders with fast elements like the Hounds. The Rune Seer again shines here, chipping away at their psychic backbone. You're still fighting uphill in some cases, but you're not outclassed. And psychologically, that changes how you approach the match. You're no longer planning around miracles. You're planning around options. Then there's the mirror match, other Space Marines. And wow, this one feels completely different now. Before, Wolves were often seen as the less refined cousin. Blood Angels had better charge synergy, White Scars had better movement, even Ultramarines had stronger staying power. But now, Wolves feel like they've found their lane again. They don't just try to play the same game, they make it their game. The new units force other chapters to react instead of dictate. You bring Hrolf into a match with a Gravis-heavy list, and suddenly that opponent is thinking twice about every step. You field Wolfen in clever cover positions, and they're burning resources just trying to get line of sight. It's a back and forth again, not a slow march to a predictable outcome. Some matchups have gotten a little trickier too. Knights, especially the Chaos variants, can still be rough. They're just so hard to trade into efficiently, and even though we've got more tools now, punching up is always risky. That said, being able to threaten their support characters or clog their movement lanes with wolves and hounds gives you something to work with. It's not great, but it's better than it was. The hope here is that with better movement and layered threats, we can eventually outmaneuver rather than outgun. Necrons are an interesting case. On paper, their durability and reanimation mechanics look like a nightmare for a melee-focused army. And yeah, they still are to a degree. But I've seen the tide shift a little here too. Wolves can now play the attrition game better. Not great, but better. You're not just charging into a wall of scarabs hoping to make a dent. You're maneuvering, isolating units, denying resurrection points, and striking when the timing is right. The psychic support helps more than people expected in this matchup. And once the wolves get into the squishier tech units or backline characters, it's chaos for the Necrons. Across the board, the biggest shift has been agency. Wolves aren't locked into a single win fast or lose hard mindset anymore. They can play the long game, they can adapt mid-match, and they can actually respond to what's happening on the board. That's massive in a game where being outmaneuvered often matters more than raw stats. For a long time, it felt like matchups were just math problems we had to solve with luck. Now they feel like duels, like hunts. It's still early, of course. The meta is a living thing, always shifting, always mutating. But already, I'm seeing a kind of respect return. Players are no longer assuming wolves are a soft matchup. They're planning for them. They're scared of getting flanked. They're keeping units back just in case a Rune Seer or a pack of Wolfen comes barreling in from the edge. That's the dream, really. Not just to win, but to matter. And with these new models in play, the Space Wolves finally feel like contenders again. Not because they're overpowered, but because they play the game in a way that demands attention. When the new Space Wolves models were first teased, the buzz started almost immediately. But as soon as they actually hit the tables, the internet went into full-on howl mode. YouTube thumbnails lit up with frosty blues and wolf heads, Reddit threads exploded with tactical breakdowns and fanboy joy, and Discord servers that had been quiet on the Wolves front suddenly turned into strategy dens packed with battle reports and hot takes. The reaction wasn't lukewarm. It wasn't even cautiously optimistic. It was electric. And the big question everyone was asking wasn't, are they cool? That was obvious. But is this real? Top tournament players were the first to raise their eyebrows. Normally, wolves don't get much love in competitive circles unless someone's trying something niche or me. But this time, names we usually associate with Iron Hand's efficiency or Elder trickery were suddenly giving serious analysis on the Space Wolves. People like Richard Siegler, Nick Nanavati, and even the salty veterans of competitive 40K began looking at the new data sheets and saying, okay, this might be something. There wasn't instant consensus, which is always a good sign. Some thought the new units were solid but situational. Others felt they opened up archetypes the Wolves hadn't had access to before. But no one was dismissing them outright. That's when I knew something was different. YouTube channels like Auspex Tactics, Tabletop Titans, and Vanguard Tactics dove in almost immediately. There were full-on deep dives with titles like, Is This the Space Wolves Comeback? Or Why Hrolf Thunderhowl is Breaking the Meta, sort of. These weren't fluff pieces. They went into stats, synergies, battlefield roles. But what made them stand out to me was the tone. There was this undercurrent of excitement, like the presenters were finally getting to talk about a faction they'd always wanted to see shine. And the comment sections reflected that. People were chiming in with tournament results, personal test games, and tons of I haven't played Space Wolves in years, but now I might kinda comments. It wasn't just theory crafting, it was momentum. Reddit, of course, was a mess in the best possible way. Our Warhammer competitive had its usual skeptics, sure. Lots of Mathhammer and, but can they beat Eldar turn 2? Discourse. But there was also a ton of constructive optimism. The Space Wolves subreddit itself became a celebration zone. People posted their painted new units, talked about their first games with the updated builds, and shared wild matchups where their opponent didn't expect the new tricks and got absolutely shredded. The vibe was something I hadn't felt in that community for a long time, a kind of collective relief. Like, finally we're not just playing for theme points anymore. And then came the first tournament wins. Not massive GT victories, at least not yet, but real, tangible results. There was a player who took a mixed wolves list with new units to a mid-size event and placed top 3. Another went undefeated in a smaller RTT, running Hrolf with a Frostclaw core and support Wulfen, and people noticed. These weren't lucky draws. These were clean plays, good trades, smart objective pressure, the kind of wins you only get when the army has real tools. What made it feel even more legitimate was the diversity in builds. This wasn't a case of, here's the one broken combo everyone is spamming. Instead, people were winning with slightly different takes. Some went hound heavy with movement tricks. Others built bunker-style lists with a psychic core and countercharge elements. It showed that the new models didn't just create one good path. They opened up an entire set of strategies that had previously been closed to us. That's real evolution, not just hype. Of course, there are still doubters. Some tournament-focused folks point out that wolves still struggle into ultra-durable factions and don't have the kind of defensive layering that top-tier lists rely on. They're not wrong. The new stuff gives us options, but it doesn't break the game. And maybe that's a good thing. Because what we're seeing now isn't the rise of an overpowered monster. It's the return of a faction that finally feels like it can fight again. There's nuance now, and with nuance comes staying power. I even saw a hilarious post on one of the big 40K Facebook groups that summed it up perfectly. Space Wolves players walking into tournaments like they just remembered how to use their claws. That's it. That's the energy. It's not arrogance, it's confidence. A faction that used to get side-eyed as a narrative pick or hobbyist's passion project is now a real contender again, and people are reacting accordingly. Some fans are even calling this a soft renaissance for Wolves, not just because of the models, but because of how the release has energized the community. Painters are posting new armies, writers are talking about new campaigns, streamers are scheduling matchups that actually feature the faction again. It's like the howl is echoing through every corner of the hobby, and that's not nothing. That's culture shift level stuff. There's also this really interesting layer to the conversation about power level. A lot of folks, myself included, aren't just happy that the wolves are doing better. We're happy they're doing better without relying on gimmicks or broken interactions. There's an authenticity to the way this update plays out. It feels earned. It feels like something that will still be fun to play even after the hype dies down. That's important, because hype burns out fast. But real evolution? That sticks. So yeah, it's early days. We haven't seen wolves dominate the top tables of a super major yet. But we're already seeing results, hearing praise, and maybe most importantly, feeling the shift in the way people talk about the faction. That's not just noise. That's the sound of the pack coming back together. And whether or not we ever see Hrolf lift a trophy, the fact that he's even in the conversation means more than most people realize. It's not just about winning. It's about mattering again. As much as I love what the new Space Wolves have brought to the table, and I really do, it'd be dishonest not to admit there's a little nervousness in the air. The kind of nervousness that creeps in when something you care about suddenly starts performing a little too well and the rest of the community starts to notice. Because in Warhammer, there's a fine line between a faction getting the love it deserves and a faction accidentally breaking the balance. And yeah, people are already whispering the phrase that haunts every big release, power creep. Now, I want to be clear. No one's saying that Space Wolves have become unbeatable monsters overnight. But some of these new units are raising eyebrows, especially in competitive spaces. You've got models like Hrolf Thunderhowl, who is tanky, hits like a thunderhammer to the face, and has synergy that makes him a constant threat on the board. Then you throw in the reworked Wulfen, who've gone from being a risky melee bomb to a controlled, efficient blender squad, and suddenly you've got a faction that's not just thematic, it's consistently dangerous. That's where the tension starts building. A few voices in the competitive scene have already started questioning whether some of these rules maybe go a little too far. You'll see posts breaking down optimal stat-to-cost ratios, people comparing unit efficiency across factions, and the phrase push design getting thrown around. It's the kind of analysis that often starts with genuine curiosity, but slowly morphs into anxiety, because no one wants to see a faction they love turn into the problem child of the edition. And I get it. We've all been burned before. We remember the broken combos, the FAQ nerf hammers, the meta-choking builds that made the game feel less like a tactical duel and more like a coin flip based on who brought the right broken unit. The fear here isn't that Space Wolves are too good. It's that they might become too good if GW isn't careful. The kind of too good that warps list building, forces mirror matches, and invites the dreaded ban list conversations. Some people are already calling out Rolf in particular, not because he's overpowered in a vacuum, but because of what he enables. He forces reactions, shuts down certain strategies, and makes it very hard for some armies to keep their key units alive. The fact that he's not just a beatstick, but also a force multiplier, makes him one of those rare characters who can shift the tide of a match by existing. And when you have something like that in a game that's already as complex and delicate as 10th edition, it's only natural to ask, did they go too far? The Frostclaw pack is another hot topic. On their own, they're not breaking any records. But their mobility, volume of attacks, and synergy with existing buffs means they slot into nearly any list effortlessly. Some fans are starting to joke that they're too good at being average. In other words, they do everything well enough that you stop looking at other options. And when one unit becomes the automatic choice, that's often the first step toward unhealthy list homogenization. It's not dramatic yet, but it's something people are watching closely. There's also some quiet grumbling from players of other factions who feel like their own updates weren't handled with the same care. Orcs, for instance, have always struggled with consistency, and some players are pointing at the new wolves and saying, "Where's our love?" It's not a direct comparison, obviously, but in a game this large, it's hard not to feel frustrated when one faction seems to leap forward while others stay stuck in neutral. Balance in Warhammer isn't just math, it's emotional. People want to feel like their army matters, and when one gets a flashy, powerful update while others are left waiting, that tension boils over. Another layer to all this is the question of sustainability. If every new release is going to feel like a mini power spike, even a controlled one, then we're stuck in a cycle where the only way to stay competitive is to chase the newest thing. That's burnout fuel. And even as someone who's loving every second of playing with the new wolves, I can't help but feel a little guilty watching other factions fall behind. I don't want Space Wolves to be the new broken army. I want them to be a strong choice. That's a big difference. One invites diversity, the other breeds resentment. Interestingly, some fans have pointed out that the Wolves' power isn't just in raw numbers. It's in access. Access to tools, to threat variety, to layered synergy that many other armies don't currently have. It's not that they're breaking the rules. They're just playing the game better now. And that's kind of the core of the debate. Is that a design triumph or a red flag? Personally, I'm choosing to stay cautiously optimistic. I've been around long enough to know that every big release feels a little busted in the first few weeks. People overreact, others underreact, and somewhere in between is the truth. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't ask questions, because good balance comes from good conversation. If we see patterns forming, same units dominating every tournament list, same combos pushing out all other builds, then it's fair to raise the alarm. But we also have to acknowledge that sometimes new units just feel strong because they're fresh, well-designed, and exciting. And excitement? That's allowed. It doesn't always mean imbalance. There's been a lot of theory crafting already on what could be done if adjustments are needed. Some suggest small points increases. Others propose minor changes to keywords or aura ranges. Nothing drastic. Nothing that would gut the flavor or kill the momentum. Just careful tuning. And honestly, that's what I'd hope for too. Not a panic nerf, but a thoughtful calibration. Because the last thing anyone wants is to go from feast to famine overnight. At the end of the day, this is a good problem to have. The Wolves are finally relevant again. They're getting talked about. They're winning games. They're present. And yes, that presence comes with responsibility. From players, from designers, from the community as a whole. We need to celebrate their return while staying mindful of the broader ecosystem. Because as much as I love seeing Hrolf tear through an enemy flank like a legend reborn, I love this game more when every army gets to tell their story. Let's keep that spirit alive. claws out, but eyes open. One of the most exciting things that's happened since the release of the new Space Wolves models is watching players experiment with combinations that go beyond the boundaries of the Codex. You know that early stage where theory crafting is half mad science and half storytelling? We're deep in that now. People aren't just asking what these new units can do on their own. They're asking how they fit into the wider Imperium puzzle. And the answers are starting to look very, very interesting. It all starts with synergy. The Space Wolves have always been a little bit of a loner faction, thematically and sometimes mechanically. They like doing things their own way, even among the Adeptus Astartes. But with the new kits, there's this quiet shift toward connectivity. You start noticing how well their playstyle complements certain other Imperial factions, and suddenly, you're not just building a Space Wolves list. You're building a force of the All-Father, with the Sons of Russ at the spear point. Take Astra Militarum, for example. That's a combo you don't see too often, right? On paper, it feels like an odd match. Disciplined ranks of guardsmen next to snarling, axe-wielding lunatics. But it works. Space Wolves struggle with long-range board control, especially when they're trying to maneuver their melee threats into striking position. But Guard brings the guns, artillery, screening bodies, objective holders. You throw in a small detachment of Space Wolves, let's say a Frostclaw squad, some Fenrisian hounds, and Hrolf, and now your static fire line has bite. You punish deep strikes, you scare away flankers, and when the lines clash, those wolves come tearing through like the climax of a saga. Then there's the Adeptus Custodes pairing, which is still being explored but has potential. It's not about redundancy. Custodes already dominate in durability and elite combat. But what they lack is the chaotic unpredictability that the Space Wolves bring. That's where units like Wulfen and Hrolf add spice. You can throw them into a Custodes list for explosive charges that force opponents out of their comfort zone. Suddenly, instead of just marching toward you in a slow gold wall, your force has momentum. You're dictating turns instead of reacting to them. Some fans are calling it the Spear and Fang build, the idea of combining control and aggression in a way that lets you crack more rigid enemy formations. And of course, we've got to talk about the Sisters of Battle. This is where things get both wild and thematic. Picture a board where the Adepta Sororitas are holding the sacred center with their acts of faith and miracle dice, holding firm against all odds. Now imagine wolves circling the flanks, hunting enemy characters, cutting off reinforcements. There's a real beauty to how these forces play off each other. Sisters bring reliable mid-board presence, strong stratagem support, and layered durability. Space Wolves bring aggression, disruption, and psychological pressure. Together, you're playing a game of faith and fury, and it feels like a narrative, not just a combo. Even Imperial Knights, usually a mismatch with infantry-heavy builds, are getting thrown into the blender. I've seen some lists where a single armiger or two are used purely to draw fire and crack transports, while the Space Wolves units swoop in behind the distraction to finish the job. It's risky, but it creates a tempo your opponent often can't keep up with. You're forcing choices. Do they focus the Knight? Do they screen the Wulfen? Do they try to stop the Rune Seer from warping the psychic phase? By the time they decide, you've already scored points and taken ground. The real beauty, though, is how fluid the combinations feel now. Before, adding Space Wolves to another army often felt like bringing a square peg to a round hole. You could do it, but it was awkward. Now, with the way the new units interact, it's more like adding color to a black and white painting. You're not just slapping melee onto a gun line, you're adding dimension, timing, threat layering. Wolves don't just hit hard anymore, they hit smart. That makes them easier to blend into broader Imperium forces. And there's growing discussion about shared keywords and buffs. The fact that the new Rune Seer can contribute to layered psychic defense has people thinking about Grey Knight synergy, or even Inquisition lists where having a mobile, aggressive psyker makes up for their traditionally fragile assets. I saw one list where the Rune Seer was used alongside an Inquisitor to double up on control over enemy spells, a kind of warp denial duo that also packed a punch in combat. That's not just clever, that's cool. On the modeling and narrative side, fans are loving the opportunities this opens up. People are building themed armies that blend elements of the Imperium into a unified force. I saw a guy on Reddit post his Crusade of the Fang project, a Space Wolves-led battle group with guard tanks, sister squads, and a single knight painted in muted wolf grays. It looked incredible, but more importantly, it played well too. That's what Synergy should do. Let you tell new stories on the table without sacrificing performance. It's worth mentioning that not all combos are equally strong. There are definitely some that sound better on paper than they are in practice. For example, adding wolves to AdMech doesn't always work out unless you're very intentional about what roles each unit fills. Same goes for Deathwatch. The flavor might be there, but the mechanics can get messy. But honestly, I kind of love that. Not everything should click instantly. There should be room to experiment, to tweak, to mess it up a few times before you find the magic formula. What's interesting is how the community seems more open to these combinations now. Before, suggesting Space Wolves in a mixed Imperium list might have earned you a shrug at best or a meme tier label at worst. Now people are asking for advice. They're sharing test results. They're talking about wolves as a flexible tool, not just a thematic side project. That shift in perception might be the most powerful synergy of all. And yeah, it's still early days. We're going to see a lot of variations, a lot of oddball builds, some failures, and some flashes of brilliance. But that's the fun part. That's what keeps the game alive. The idea that you can bring the fury of Fenris into any battlefield and find a place for it, not because it's broken or meta-warping, but because it just works. Because it adds something that other units can't replicate. That's where we're at right now. Space Wolves are no longer an isolated beast, howling in the cold. They're part of the pack again. Not just their own pack, but the greater Imperium, a force that can stand shoulder to shoulder with allies and still keep their own identity sharp and feral. And in a galaxy this grim and dark, that kind of unity without uniformity is something special. There's something strange and kind of thrilling about watching your favorite faction rise from the shadows and re-enter the spotlight. It doesn't happen often, especially in a game as brutally competitive as Warhammer 40k. But here we are, and the question a lot of Space Wolves players are now asking is no longer, are we viable? But something much bigger. Are we going to stay here? Could this really be the start of a long-term shift for the faction? One that takes the Space Wolves from cult favorite to top table staple? Let's be honest. Historically, Wolves have always danced around the edge of greatness without ever quite breaking into that S-tier elite. They've had moments, flashes of brilliance, and even a few top-tier performances during the right meta windows. But they've never consistently sat at the top. There's always been a limitation, whether it was lack of flexibility, poor internal balance, or just an awkward fit into the edition's mechanics. And fans, myself included, learned to live with that. We leaned into the flavor, the narrative, the sagas. We told ourselves we didn't need to be top tier to be legendary. But now the possibility is on the table, and it's forcing us to dream a little bigger. With the new models and rules in place, the Space Wolves feel like a faction that finally has the tools to stay relevant. Not just briefly, but in a sustained way. They're not relying on one broken interaction or an overpowered combo that'll get patched next month. Instead, they're leveraging depth. That's the secret. This update didn't just give us new toys. It gave us options, and options are what carry a faction through the unpredictable tides of the meta. The real sign of potential longevity is adaptability, and that's exactly what this new iteration of the Wolves brings to the table. They can pressure the board early with Frost Claws and Hounds. They can hit hard in the mid-game with Wolfen and character-led charges. They can hold their own in psychic duels with the Rune Seer, and they can even lean into synergy builds with other Imperial forces. That spread of threat vectors means you're not boxed into one strategy. And in a game that shifts as often as 40k does, that's pure gold. Of course, the term S-tier is always controversial. It's a moving target, and it's heavily influenced by tournament results, data aggregation, and, let's face it, popular perception. Some factions get branded as top tier because they win events, others because they're hard to counter, and some just get there by sheer presence. When you see them in every top 8 week after week, the Wolves aren't quite there yet, but there's this quiet sense that they could be. And for a faction that was scraping the bottom just a few months ago, that's a massive leap. What makes this situation so unique is that the Wolves aren't climbing the ladder with brute force. They're doing it with design. The new rules support their identity without trapping them in it. They still feel like the unpredictable saga-born killers of old, but now they have clarity. They have precision. You're not flailing toward the enemy and hoping for the best. You're planning. You're reacting. You're controlling. That's what wins games, not just in casual matches, but at the highest level. And that's what gives me hope for the future. Because in past editions, even when the Wolves were good, it always felt a little fragile. One nerf, one shift in secondaries or mission structure, and the whole build would collapse. But now the foundation is stronger. We're not betting everything on one unit or one stratagem. We've got depth. We've got layers. That's how you stay in the game when everything else changes. Still, it's not all guaranteed. A few rough FAQs or a shift in mission design could push us back toward mediocrity. That's the nature of the beast. But the difference now is that we're starting from a better place. We're not trying to claw our way up from the bottom. We're building from the middle. And that's where most enduring S-tier factions come from. They start by becoming consistently good, and then they evolve. There's also something to be said about the momentum in the community. A faction's presence in the meta isn't just about stats, it's about enthusiasm. It's about people wanting to bring them to events, test them, talk about them, and optimize them. And right now, that's exactly what's happening. Every week you see more Wolves lists show up in event breakdowns, not always winning, but placing, competing, scoring high on secondary missions. That's how it starts. That's how factions rise. Some people are already trying to map out the Wolves' ceiling. They're asking, what's the best version of this army? What does the S-tier list look like? And the truth is, there might not be just one. The strength of this release is that it supports multiple builds: aggressive swarm, elite strike force, mixed Imperium hybrid, and that kind of internal variety makes it harder to predict and harder to counter. That's a mark of a strong faction, and the Wolves are finally earning that label. There's also a theory floating around that we might be witnessing a shift in design philosophy. That maybe this is Games Workshop's new approach. Give each faction a toolkit that reflects its identity while also allowing it to flex with the meta. If that's true, if the Wolves are just the first step, then this isn't just good news for us. It's good news for the game. Because it means the power spikes might finally be giving way to power foundations. And if that happens, Space Wolves might become a case study in how to elevate a faction without breaking it. So, will the Space Wolves become an S-tier army? I think they already are, just not in the way people usually define it. They're not dominating every event or wiping out the competition in 2 turns. But they're dangerous, respected, feared again, and most importantly, played. That's the first step toward real staying power. Where we go from here depends on balance updates, player dedication, and the ever-evolving nature of the game. But for the first time in a long time, the Wolves aren't chasing the meta. They're part of it. They're shaping it. And if they keep growing, keep adapting, and keep howling loud enough, who knows? Maybe one day we won't even have to ask if they're S-tier. We'll just assume it, because the galaxy will know the Wolves are hunting. So now that we've howled our way through every layer of this release, the visuals, the gameplay, the matchups, the hype, the synergy, the questions, the theories, we circle back to the question that started it all. Did the new Space Wolves models actually change the meta? And if they did, was it because of raw power? Or was it something deeper? Honestly, I think the answer is both, but with a strong lean toward style. And I don't mean that in a superficial way. Style in Warhammer 40K isn't just about how cool your models look on the shelf or what color you paint your shoulder pads. It's about identity. It's about the way your army feels to play, the way it moves, reacts, threatens, and takes hits. It's the personality of your list, the story it tells on the tabletop, and how it makes you feel when you command it. And the truth is, these new Space Wolves models didn't just make the army better. They made the army whole again. Before this update, playing Space Wolves often felt like a compromise. You loved the theme, the lore, the flavor, but you had to work twice as hard to make them function competitively. You sacrificed efficiency for identity, power for personality. That's fine for casual games, but in the heat of a serious match, that tension always showed. The Wolves were fierce but incomplete, dangerous but predictable, glorious but fragile. Now they finally feel like they're standing with both feet planted firmly on the battlefield. They have presence. They have rhythm. They're no longer the ragged underdogs snapping at the heels of better balanced armies. They're a real force, and the community knows it. You feel it in the way your opponents respect the charge, the way people talk about Hrolf like a real meta piece, the way list builders on forums and in Discord channels are finally including Space Wolves in their "what do we need to plan for" discussions. That alone is a massive shift. But what's interesting is that the power of this update isn't just in the numbers. Yes, the units are solid. Yes, there's better synergy, stronger options, more flexibility. But the bigger change? It's in the mentality of the players. We're no longer playing on our back foot. We're thinking ahead, planning, pushing the tempo, dictating turns instead of reacting to them. That's something we haven't felt in years. And it's electric. This is why I say the impact is rooted in style, not surface-level style, but the kind that lives deep in the DNA of the faction. These new models finally align with what Space Wolves should be. Fast, furious, tactical, wild but not reckless, noble but not naive. Every piece of the army now contributes to that vision. From the controlled aggression of the Frostclaw pack to the calculated fury of the Wulfen, from the psychic finesse of the Rune Seer to the brutal inevitability of Hrolf, it all just clicks. It feels right. And when your faction feels right, you play better, you build better, you think better. That psychological edge might not show up on a data sheet, but it changes games just as much as a re-roll aura. Of course, there's still plenty of work ahead. The meta is always shifting, and no army stays on top forever. But that's not the point. The goal was never to make the Wolves dominant. It was to make them viable in a way that respected their spirit. And this release absolutely nailed that. It brought back the fear, the flavor, and the flexibility. It gave new life to a faction that had spent too long howling in the shadows. And judging by the reactions across the board, from casual players to top-tier competitors, it wasn't just a good update. It was the right one. There's also something beautiful about how this return has sparked creativity again. People are writing new narrative campaigns, painting whole new armies, crafting conversions, making lore videos, writing battle reports, even coming up with fan-made sagas. The Wolves aren't just back in the meta, they're back in the imagination of the community. That's the kind of resurgence you can't manufacture. It only happens when something lands just right. So yeah, did the new models change the meta? I think they did, but not by overpowering it. They changed it by enriching it, by reminding players that power and personality don't have to be mutually exclusive, by proving that a faction with deep flavor can still hang with the best of them, not because it compromises, but because it commits. That's what the new Space Wolves have done. They've committed to the lore, to the gameplay, to the pack. And if you're a long-time Space Wolves player, now's the time to come back. If you're new and thinking about starting them, do it. There's never been a better moment. Whether you're here for the sagas or the stats, the glory or the grind, the table is set. The wolves are howling. The hunt is on. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the rise of the new Space Wolves, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the pack. I've got plenty more content coming, from tactical breakdowns to lore explorations to full-on army showcases. Drop a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me, How are you running your wolves? Until next time, stay feral, stay fearless, and remember, the Emperor protects, but the wolves bite back.